Today, at the cutting edge of civilization, we are drowning in what many are calling a mental health crisis, or a crisis of meaning. People will say their life feels pointless, that they're just going through the motions with no real purpose, or they feel exhausted all the time, but unable to rest, or they're surrounded by modern luxuries that would dazzle the vast majority of history's kings, and yet they're always emotionally raw, never able to feel at peace or content. If you accept that there really does exist a way to peace and happiness and resilience through trials, then I would think you also agree that we've lost the way. But do you think we can get it back? My name's Corey Queen. I'm a Seattle attorney and former campus minister, and today we'll look at where we as a society wandered off that life-giving path, then list some very practical, concrete tools for getting back onto it. Tools that, if you wanted to, you could put into practice immediately, today. But to understand the path that we've wandered off of, we first have to understand an ancient enemy that we all have, an enemy that the ancient world across multiple cultures was deeply familiar with. The beginning of the book of Genesis is especially interesting because it says God creates the universe, and what exists immediately after that is chaos, a sea that's formless and void, and it's out of this sea of chaos that God extracts life. As the story goes on, he brings order. He gives everything a purpose, a function. He gives a meaning to its existence. And instead of the ever-shifting sea, he gives his creatures solid ground to stand on. And with this order, with well-defined limits, life becomes possible. But what you may be surprised to learn is that we human beings have a similar pattern inside of us. From the ground up, so to speak, we have something like chaos in the deepest parts of our brains, what they call the limbic system, our instincts, our subconscious, what Carl Jung called the shadow self, the parts of us that our rational, conscious mind can't see and struggles to understand. The prophet Jeremiah famously wrote, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" In the Psalms, the poet often asks God to search out the deepest heart and get rid of anything that shouldn't be there. In one of the Apostle Paul's most famous passages, he very strikingly says, "I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do." This also has been understood from the beginning, that the unseen parts of ourselves are powerful and often dangerous. That primordial sea, that abyss, that chaos, it exists inside of us. Those undercurrents are moving below the surface where it's hard to see, but they often break out in the open and make us do or say or feel unexpected things, and then we'll say, "I can't believe I did that. That wasn't me." That's part of the universal human experience. So historically, how did we deal with it? Well, we gathered into communities. In community, we told each other myths and stories full of symbolism that gave us tools for navigating the chaos. In community, we sharpened each other because our undercurrents may be invisible to us, but they often aren't invisible to the people around us. In community, we put structures in place, moral rules of justice and fair dealing and benevolence. And the structures weren't just rules, we also built in periodic rituals like festivals and holidays, or even some more day-to-day rituals like reading or having meals together. In community, we assigned different tasks to people based on their unique skills so that everyone could benefit from everyone else's work. To sum it up, in community, we ordered our lives and we did it together. The chaos that lurks all around and inside of us wants to break out and break things and break people. The ancients found that a communal, well-ordered life kept the chaos at bay. But then enter modernism. So I'm about to give you a very brief history of our mental health collapse. And at the end, when I point out the culprit, I think you may be surprised at just how obvious it was right from the beginning. So as the Enlightenment takes shape and we enter modernism, personal freedom and autonomy become some of our highest values. As part of that, we become increasingly suspicious of religion because it has rules and restrictions. We begin to view science as the best or even the only method for understanding the world. And on this scientism, which we should not mistake for science itself, we believe that we can make progress as a species. And so progress itself becomes a value. To be progressive becomes a good thing. And the words ancient or classical come to be seen as one and the same with stale and outdated. And what did this post-Enlightenment modernist project achieve for us? 2 world wars and some of the cruelest, most murderous government regimes the world has ever seen. Some progress. Thus enter postmodernism. We start to say, yikes, our big, beautiful progress took us right to the Holocaust. Maybe progress is a myth. Maybe we're not going anywhere. Maybe we can't know anything. And we start to treat the human experience as entirely subjective, and for many, totally devoid of meaning. We invent ourselves, and if we want meaning, we invent that too. At this stage, personal freedom and autonomy become even more important, and tolerance becomes a very high value. Nobody knows anything anyway, not really, so don't judge me, don't criticize me, don't tell me how to live my life. What's right for you may not be what's right for me, and that's okay. To each his own. And what did postmodernism give us? Well, the main thing is a mental health crisis, but not the one we're in right now. A precursor to it. A really popular book that came out in the year 2000, in the late stages of postmodernism, was Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, where he observes the rapidly increasing trend toward loneliness, isolation, and poor mental health. And millions of people read that book and loved it and recognized how true it was, and nothing changed. Thus, in that happy state, enter Metamodernism. In 2006, Facebook becomes available to the general public. Other social media platforms take off, and our mental health, which was already fragile during postmodernism, is shattered as we enter into what they call metamodernism, because postmodernism sounds ridiculous, and whose idea was it to name an era modernism when it would obviously become outdated? Anyhow, we threw out the organizations, moral systems, and routines that kept us afloat in the past, and what did we replace them with? Nothing. That's not to say there haven't been efforts to claw back some of our mental health. As we fled the churches and fled community in general, therapy emerged as the gold standard in mental health. We started outsourcing our self-exploration and personal growth to professionals who don't know us at all, except in the context of psychological treatment. Some wonderful research and literature has come out of that project too. I love Jung's work. I love CBT, rooting harmful lies out of ourselves and replacing them with healthy truths. But of course, none of it has stopped us from arriving at our current mental health crisis, in part because it was never meant to. Modern therapy addresses the individual, not the system that produced them. So then, what is wrong with the system? Why the mental health crisis? I told you the culprit would be obvious, right? So what happened when we tossed out all the structures and routines and communities that the ancients used to keep chaos at bay? Well, she came back. She lurks in creation. She lurks inside all of us. She wants to break out, and she's awfully seductive. Why do you think the sea, associated with chaos from the beginning, has also been associated with sirens from the beginning? Because there's a seduction to the wild, free, unpredictable sea. Even if we know deep down that she can destroy us, she's still somehow alluring. And just look at what she's doing now. We're drowning in a mental health crisis, and yet many will, with great passion, defend the systems, or lack thereof, that got us here. It goes deeper. There's a word that in our modern culture is taken as very churchy and stilted, but in the ancient Greek it has a couple of specialized meanings, and the word is sin. And today we just take it to mean, you broke the rules, God zaps you for that. But originally in the Greek, there were two main words for sin, and one is hamartia, which is an archery term for missing your target, or you could think of it as deviating from the path. And the other Greek word is anomia, which means lawlessness, without law. Sounds terrifying to a lawyer. And it's well understood throughout the Bible that sin, stepping off the path, living without any law, leads very naturally to uncontrollable anxiety, depression, anger, loneliness. It's not just breaking the rules, it's breaking yourself, falling into chaos. For most of human history, it's been common knowledge that chaos is not where you want to be. Until today. Today, we think unfettered freedom to do whatever you want will somehow lead to happiness, as it has never done for anyone. And when we really think about it, we know that. We don't like what unfettered freedom looks like when it takes the form of racism, or a small handful of billionaires hoarding everyone's resources, or school shootings. We would like those freedoms restrained. We want at least some order. And in fact, I would bet that somewhere deep down in just about all of us, we know that the way things are isn't the way they're supposed to be. So then, what now? In a world adrift on a sea of chaos, drowning in a mental health crisis, what do we do? This is a practical question, so I'll suggest 4 practical answers. First, if you are one of the many whose smartphone is an extension of your arm and your brain, then you are actively fracturing your prefrontal cortex. That's the orderly, disciplined, wise part of your brain. You're breaking it into tiny pieces, making it all but impossible to focus on what matters. Addiction to screens has been shown again and again to make your brain less disciplined, more reactive, more chaotic, more exhausted, more miserable. The science is strong on this. Much of our mental health crisis has been traced to our screens. Never has chaos been more seductive than she is today, and perhaps never more harmful. Now, Cal Newport has an excellent book on this called Digital Minimalism. It offers tools for engaging our screens on our own terms rather than letting them run our lives. But however you do it, just the simple, not easy, act of resisting screen addiction will go a long way toward restoring your mental health. Here's a second suggestion. Sit down with a journal and write out where you've been, where you are, and where you want to be, and then write down the concrete steps it would take to get you from where you are to where you want to be. Take your time with this. Be thorough. Be honest with yourself. Ask for insights about yourself from people who know you well. Ask for advice from people you admire. In doing this, you are building into your life a clear telos, a purpose, a direction that means something to you, and one that you can revisit often. I revisit mine at least every 3 months so that every single day, everything I do fits within the context of an overall direction. No chaos allowed. Life is orderly. Chaos is the engine of decay. All right, a third suggestion is to get meaningfully involved in a local community. The most obvious would be a church, undoubtedly full of broken, imperfect people, and you would be one of them. And you can grow and do life together and support each other through the hard times. Doing life within a community of people that you love and who love you is a well-established, powerful boost to your mental health. The science is equally strong on this. But further, it goes to a very helpful concept from Freud that is often overlooked nowadays, the idea of the superego. Freud coined the terms id, ego, and superego, but we really only talk about the id, the subconscious, and the ego, our conscious mind. The superego lives at the overarching societal level. It's what you might think of as the cultural norms and values that govern us. For many, if not most people, their values are being framed haphazardly by their screens, social media, shows and movies, news outlets, influencers, and so they're being swept along wherever the currents happen to be flowing, no matter how irrational or harmful. Those currents run on popularity, not wisdom, so who knows where they'll take you. This whole modern system, which they call the attention economy, thrives on chaos. So when you simultaneously unplug from your screens and plug into a community, you are choosing your superego. You are choosing the cultural air you breathe. And ask yourself, would you rather breathe the cultural air of a community that loves you and that you chose, or breathe the polluted air generated by tech giants who are actively fueling mental illness to profit off of your attention? Which air do you think is more life-giving and conducive to mental health? Okay, one last suggestion. Don't run away from suffering. This is very countercultural nowadays, but yet again, it is well established that strong, happy, mentally healthy people are not the people who've managed to cut all pain and difficulty out of their lives. I mean, have you ever paid attention to the lives of the fabulously wealthy? Do they seem mentally healthy to you? No. Strong, happy, mentally healthy people have learned to face suffering head on, and just like with physical exercise, their suffering makes them stronger. Now, there is a reason this suggestion is last. It's not because it's less important, but it is because it comes logically after the earlier points. It is true that there's no sense in running away from suffering, but it's also true that there's no sense in suffering just to suffer. The suffering should mean something. And once you've entered a community and gotten your life started in a direction that you want to go, that's where you will undoubtedly find suffering on that path. Communities are certainly painful, like any family, and you'll have to endure hurt from the people around you. It's worth it. The alternative is the slow burn of loneliness, which is far worse, but that doesn't mean it's not painful. And going after meaningful goals is painful and difficult. If you expect to reach them, it will only be on the other side of suffering. Again, it's worth it, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Fortunately, in community, you'll help each other along, and then everyone gets farther. So one of my favorite passages is another one from Jeremiah the prophet, where he says, "Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." That line was written in the 500s BC. It's ancient, and yet it points us to paths even more ancient, well-defined, orderly paths where there is peace and life and rest from all the chaos. It's a popular belief nowadays that those ancient paths that Jeremiah wrote about are outdated, but perhaps we should question popular beliefs when they're generated by a culture that's drowning in a mental health crisis. To me, saying these ancient ways are outdated is like saying it's outdated to drink water. There are some things that have always promoted human flourishing and always will.